Hi friends, this is Marilyn from TarotClarity.com again, and today's video is quick on the heels of yesterday's video where I presented three cards and attempted to interpret those cards, depending on the question. The point was to try to illustrate how a reading may differ slightly, even though you're using the same three cards, depending on the question. It occurred to me that it would be helpful to show how you could use a different deck with the same three cards and still come up with a different interpretation, because it all depends on the artist's vision. Now, the original three cards that I used were from the A.E. Waite, A.G. Mueller edition of the Waite Smith cards. And the deck below is the Mystical Tarot, which is a recent acquisition. I just got it yesterday, as a matter of fact. And it was just recently published in 2017. I'll put the link below, or I'll put the name of the tarot below. Now, in this second deck, we clearly see that it's greatly influenced by the Rider-Waite-Smith tradition. We have a soldier in repose. There are some slight differences, namely there's an angel here in the stained glass, which is clearly illustrated, and the stained glass here, although it's there in a window, just the same, it's a little bit more vague. There are four swords in this particular card, and there are four here, of course, for the four swords, but one of them is suspended. And then rather than having the fourth sword on the sarcophagus, this particular deck has the sarcophagus ornamented with butterflies. Now we have the three swords, which very clearly borrows from the same idea. There's no rain in this particular one. There are clouds, and the heart here, interestingly, aside from the fact that it's a face, it's actually like an actual heart. You can see I'm not a doctor, but I'm going to throw out some heart terms like the aorta and the valves and stuff like that. So it's actually a reference, to maybe physical heartache, physical, not just emotional, but actually of a physical nature, or so stressful that it causes, maybe some kind of physical reaction. We also have, I'm not positive, I think those are moths. And then we have what appear to be doves flying over a sphere. I don't know that the sphere is the earth, but it's reminiscent of that. So even though these two cards are clearly of the Rider-Waite-Smith tradition, there are some differences, that we might pick up on. And I'll give you those examples when I finish the third card, which is, of course, the 10 Cups. And again, it very much owes to the Rider-Waite-Smith tradition of a set of parents with children. They're facing, in this one, a rainbow of cups. Here there's a double tier of cups, but it's the same idea. Their beautiful, wonderful estate is in the background. Their wonderful home, their good life is clearly represented in this particular card. Now, with minor exceptions, in the case of the first alternate reading, where I said, what if a woman, somebody comes and they want to know about the relationship? My interpretation using this particular bottom deck might not vary all that much from what I would have said using these cards. But I think in the case of the gentleman who was a widower, I might have had some difference in how I might have interpreted the at least the first card, in the sense that this card more clearly really illustrates, death, as somebody has passed, especially since the question had to do with the passing of a loved one. And we have the comfort of an angel here, which might bring, some comfort. And, the suggestion of butterflies that for many people represents when someone has passed on, and that they're, remain present in our lives. And the suspended sword is intriguing because, it kind of suggests that there's a threat to him, you know, if there's a threat to him, you know, and, you know, maybe he has to, you know, concern himself with, you know, the physical concerns that this card further suggests, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to get into like everything all over again. But, you know, although these cards generally adhere to these meanings, there are slight differences that you might pick up on depending on the question. And that's just what I was trying to point out, that the question regarding the widower from yesterday's video might be slightly altered, you know, by using these cards rather than those. Let's think, what were the other questions? The relationship question, you know, might be generally the same. And the work question might be generally, you know, my response might have generally been the same. Something else might have struck me, you know, minimally, but I think the biggest difference, as I just mentioned, would be in the case of the widower. Now let's try another set of cards. Now here we have the same three cards, the Four of Swords, the Three of Swords, and the Ten of Cups. Say we had those same set of questions and we were interpreting the questions using these cards. You can see how these individual cards may give us a different idea. For example, although the Four Swords is very similar, we do see figures in repose. We see two figures here, and they're outdoors. There's no religious connotation here. Maybe they're in a cemetery, maybe their bodies are on display. And so, you know, you pick up on the sky is orange. So depending on the question, I would pick up from these clues a little differently than I would pick up from this clue. Now, from the clues in this card. Now, the Three Swords in both cards do show, you know, a certain amount of despair for this individual. Oops, sorry. This particular individual is going through something, just the same. But there's a greater sense of isolation. We know we have a very black sky, or it's extremely deep blue. I'm not sure if it's blue or black, but extremely, you know, dark sky with the 6 stars. And, you know, the person, you know, I get a greater sense of isolation, which would be, you know, a feature in the interpretation that I would give in, you know, whatever the question was. And here, finally, with the 10 cups, this particular, oh, and this deck, excuse me for not identifying it, is the Dame Fortune's Wheel Tarot, which was created by Paul Hewson, and I'll also properly identify the deck below as well. I do get a different take from this 10 of Cups than I do from the Rider Waite Smith 10 of Cups. Here I get a sense of, you know, one's comfort zone, you know, everything is wonderful in the world that they're accustomed to, and you know, their world is perfect, but it's enclosed, you know, and there's no, you know, there's no outside experience. And so that gives me quite a different, you know, although that's a very contented life and it's a very good life, it gives me a different feeling than this card, because again, with these two cards, there's a sense of isolation and a need to like go out, you know, have a life, you know. So you see, you know, but with these cards, we even get a different interpretation than even the deck that I just used. Now we'll go on with another deck. Now this deck is the Wisdom Seekers Tarot. It's a redoing of the Truth Seekers Tarot, which came out, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. At any rate, here we have the same cards represented in different ways, and this is where we clearly get a very different feeling from each of the cards. The Four Swords here, there are no figures. There's no sense of a cemetery. We have something going on in the yard here. I don't know what it is, but we have trees, and we have the arrangement of swords in a square, which of course, if you consider, you know, the number 4 in numerology, it's the sense of containment or you know, stability, and that kind of reminds me of that. I wouldn't get a sense of sadness, you know. My interpretation of the Four Swords, based, you know, on my experience with Marseille, would not be the same as this, you know. It would maybe be a calling for a need for, you know, stability in in that area of that question. There's, you know, a need for that. The Three of Swords, which follows, is quite different from the Three Swords of the previous two decks, because those, even though this one did not show a heart, it still showed, oh, wrong card. Even though this one did not show a heart, you know, it clearly shows someone who is feeling something negative and, you know, sad, and then is isolated. Well, here we get a sense of isolation, true, because the swords are blocking the entranceway to, you know, to the inside of this structure. So there's a blockage, you know, there's something not being able to make a progression. So seeing the 4 and the 3 of the same suits here, I would, you know, more likely seize upon the descending order of these cards rather than seizing on what each of these cards mean individually. You know, I'd see it more as, you know, there's a loss of stability. Something is like, you know, the nature of the question, or the individual involved, or whatever. There's a sense of it not being stable, and, you know, blocking others off, or blocking yourself off. Now here, the 10 Cups is quite different. You know, there are no individuals. And I call this deck, like much like the Houston deck that came before it, kind of like a hybrid deck. It's not quite Rider-Waite-Smith. It's not quite a Marseille. You know, maybe they lend from other, you know, philosophies. I think the Houston might borrow more heavily from Etehila. I don't know. I'm sure I said his name wrong. But Etiella. Etehila, the French. We all know about him. So, you know, and then this particular deck, the Wisdom Seekers, sometimes the artwork reminds me more of the Thoth deck. You know, just because of the artistry of the cards themselves, not necessarily because of the message they deliver. But in this case, anyway, you know, there's no sense of family, there's no sense of celebration, although there's a sense of plenty. You know, all 10 cups, even the ones that are seemingly on their sides, are full to capacity, and there's plenty to spare. You know, it's more of a card of generosity, you know, and it's not just those cups that are, you know, full and overflowing, but we have the cloud that is the source for the rain, which is, you know, supplying the cups, is the font, I guess, for the individual fonts. So there's a sense of plenty and a sense of generosity. All is really good. You know, you can be fruitful when you have water. There's, you know, it's a kind of a feast feeling because there's plenty. So you see, depending on the question, we have, you know, maybe a different interpretation with these individual cards. So it's starting to change. And then finally, I chose a rather generic Tarot de Marseille. It's this particular rendition by Los Scarabeo. It's readily available. You know, pretty standard stuff. And as I was suggesting when I was talking about the Wisdom Seekers Tarot by David Fontana, you know, where I was, you know, starting to address the number of the cards and, you know, matching it with the suit. And this is entirely how I would interpret with these cards. So you see how the difference between, you know, the tarot of Rider-Waite-Smith tradition and tarot of Marseille, their orientation is different, and nowhere is it more clear than when you use the cards side by side. Now, as I hinted, with the 4 swords and the 3 swords and the 10 cups, it's a combination. When I learned, and I taught myself, I didn't have any mentors, unfortunately. There was nothing online. I could only, you know, reference, you know, the few books that were available and how vaguely they spoke. And I kind of put things together in my own mind. And I determined that the numbers, that they're, you know, basically the cards are numbers, you know, so, and suits. So I had to reconcile what the numbers meant in accordance to what the suits suggested. And the suit of swords suggests a few things. It could suggest aggression. It could suggest assertion. It could suggest law, and it can suggest clearly, mental acuity, communication. Back in the day, it would have been communication maybe in letter or verbal. Nowadays, it could be emails. It could be telephone calls. That kind of thing. So, and the fact that the four, and the three, is going in descending order, there's a sense that whatever tension there is, it might be, being reduced to some degree. And then followed by the 10 cups, we get a sense of, there's loss that will lead to gain. And it depends on what the question is, of course. But the 10 cups, the suit of cups, my understanding of them, and you might have a different understanding, it definitely corresponds to water, like many decks do. And water is of the emotion, of the, how the moon is, dictates our tides. And so the water in us kind of like makes us emotional or not. We're definitely, affected, to some degree by that idea. And so the 10 cups here might not necessarily mean that there's a happy family life, but it might mean that there's a very satisfying emotional condition that we're in. Maybe if it was reversed, it would feel differently because the cups would be empty or, unstable, but upright, as it were. There's more a sense of a satisfying emotional condition. So something de-escalates. It wasn't a very high emotional, or it wasn't a very high level. It was only a 4 down to a 3. But maybe there was a miscommunication between two individuals, but it's resolved happily. And so depending on the question, I would not have necessarily interpreted my response in the same way that I would with the Rider-Waite-Smith. And I would have addressed each one of those questions that I did in the prior video, except that I didn't want to be here all day, and you don't want to hear me all day either. But I figured I would give you these separate cards, these decks, to reference, so that you can clearly understand, especially if you're a beginner, if you're a learner, or you have a lot of experience in the Rider-Waite-Smith tradition, but you're hedging on whether or not to do the Marseille, attempt the Marseille. It's not as intimidating. In fact, it's very liberating, and in some ways it's much more easy to learn than the Rider-Waite, because you can come up with a variety of interpretations for these 3 cards, and you're not locked into the picture here. If your gut tells you that to interpret these cards in a way that's different than, loss and despair, like as in, there was an argument, or maybe there's tension, and maybe the tension is lessened, because the number has decreased. And then the situation will resolve itself, to a satisfactory emotional state. Let's see, it could mean that there was something that was told in good faith, but the information, was, maybe misunderstood, to some degree. 3 is not as stable a number as 4, so you could look at it from that perspective. But 3 is also a number of collaboration and working together. So even if there was a miscommunication, there's the suggestion that it can be resolved because, it's a number of collaboration, especially followed by the 10 cups, which is a satisfying card. So you see, I hope this has been helpful and not confusing. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Until next time, bye.